"Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The words cut through the low hum of the underground garage as Judge Vanessa Holloway stepped out into the cold, fluorescent light, heels clicking once against the concrete before the sound seemed to disappear into the stillness. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat, tracing a slow line down to the ground, and across from her, Officer Cole Mercer stood too close, one hand already resting on the open door of her car like he owned the moment, like he had rehearsed it, his radio crackling softly at his shoulder while two other officers lingered just far enough back to watch but not intervene, their silence louder than any command. Vanessa's eyes didn't dart, didn't search for help, they settled on him, steady, measuring, as if she were already weighing the evidence of his posture, the angle of his stance, the quiet tension in his jaw. "Routine check," Mercer said, but the words felt thin, stretched over something heavier, something personal, and then he leaned in, reaching under the back seat with a confidence that didn't match the randomness he claimed, his fingers closing around something before he even looked, and when he straightened, the small plastic bag caught the overhead light, reflecting it in sharp, sterile flashes that seemed to freeze the air around them. A janitor paused near the far pillar. A clerk in a navy coat stopped mid-step. Even the distant elevator doors hesitated before sliding shut, and for a second, the entire garage held its breath. Mercer lifted the bag slightly higher, enough for everyone to see. Not enough to look like a show, but enough to make sure the moment stuck. "You want to explain this?" he asked, but there was no curiosity in it. Only satisfaction, the kind that comes before the outcome is even confirmed. Vanessa didn't move toward him, didn't step back either. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, chin level, as if the weight of the accusation couldn't bend her posture even an inch, and the faint reflection of the bag flickered across her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, something colder. Somewhere above them, a car passed overhead, the sound dull and distant, and the drip of water echoed again, marking time in slow, deliberate beats. Mercer shifted slightly, expecting something, a protest, a denial, a crack in composure, but it didn't come, and that absence began to stretch, to press against the edges of his certainty. Then she spoke, her voice calm, almost soft, but it carried cleanly through the space. "You didn't just find that," she said, each word placed with precision. "You decided it would be there." And for the first time, his grip on the bag tightened just a fraction, barely noticeable, except to the one person at the far end of the garage who had stopped walking entirely, Deputy Marshal Tessa Grant, her gaze narrowing as she replayed the last few minutes in her mind. The timeline, the angles, the small gap when Mercer had been alone near the vehicle before Vanessa ever stepped into view. Mercer let out a short breath, almost a laugh, shaking his head as if dismissing her. But the sound didn't land the way he expected. It didn't break the tension. It fed it, and the quiet around them thickened, turning heavy, watchful, waiting. Vanessa's hands remained at her sides, open, unguarded, as if she had nothing to hide and no reason to shield herself. And she met his eyes fully now, not challenging, not pleading, just certain. "Officer," she added, just enough to anchor him to the title he wore. "Whatever you think this moment is, it isn't going to end the way you planned." And somewhere behind him, a radio crackled again, louder this time, and Tessa took a single step forward, her eyes never leaving the bag, never leaving his hand, because something about it, something about the timing, was already starting to come apart. The silence did not break. It thickened, pressing against the concrete pillars and the parked cars until even the faint drip of water sounded too loud, and Officer Mercer shifted his weight just slightly, enough for the fabric of his uniform to crease, enough for the badge on his chest to catch the light in a sharp, cold flash. Behind him, one of the officers cleared his throat but said nothing, his eyes moving from the bag to Vanessa and back again as if trying to decide which version of reality to believe, while the clerk near the elevator lowered her phone halfway, unsure whether to keep recording or pretend she had never seen any of it. Vanessa remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing slow and even, as if the entire moment existed at a distance from her, something she could observe without being consumed by it. And that calm began to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable, unsettling the neat certainty Mercer had built for himself. "Turn around," he said finally, his voice firmer now, louder than before, as if volume could reassert control, but the command landed unevenly, echoing off the low ceiling and dissolving into the stillness. Vanessa did not move right away, not out of defiance, but because she was measuring him again. The timing, the impatience creeping into his tone, the way his fingers pressed too tightly around the plastic bag, distorting its shape for just a second before he loosened his grip, and when she did turn, it was deliberate, composed, each movement precise, as though she were stepping into a role she understood better than anyone in that garage. Her hands rested lightly against the cool metal of the car, not forced there, not slammed, simply placed, and the distinction mattered, even if no one else could name why. Across the space, Deputy Marshal Tessa Grant took another step forward, her boots making a soft, controlled sound that did not match the tension in her gaze, and she tilted her head slightly, watching Mercer rather than Vanessa, watching the sequence of events replay in her mind, the moment he had arrived, the gap before the search, the angle of his body as he reached inside the vehicle, details that did not align no matter how she arranged them. "You said routine," she called out, her voice steady, not confrontational but not passive either, and Mercer glanced back at her for a fraction of a second, irritation flickering across his face before he masked it. "That is right," he replied, but the words came a beat too late, as if he had to retrieve them. Tessa's eyes dropped briefly to his body camera, then to the small indicator light that should have been blinking, and the absence of that tiny signal seemed louder than anything else in the garage, a silence inside the silence, and she filed it away without another word. Vanessa felt the shift even without looking, the subtle change in attention, the way the air no longer centered entirely on Mercer's accusation but began to fracture, to question, to pull apart at the edges, and she spoke again, quieter this time, almost to herself, but clear enough to carry. "Details always tell the truth," and Mercer exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of impatience, of dismissal, yet his eyes flickered once more toward Tessa, then back to Vanessa, as if he could sense the ground beneath him beginning to loosen. Somewhere above, thunder rolled faintly, the vibration traveling through the structure and into the floor beneath their feet, and for the first time since he had lifted that bag into the light, Mercer felt the moment stretch beyond his control, just slightly, just enough to make him tighten his jaw and straighten his shoulders, clinging to the version of events he had already decided was real, while around him, without a single raised voice or sudden movement, the certainty he depended on began to crack. "Name and badge number," Vanessa said quietly, not as a demand but as a record, as if the air itself were a courtroom and every second was being entered into evidence. And that shift, subtle and precise, reframed the entire garage without anyone announcing it. Mercer hesitated for half a breath before answering, his voice sharper now. "Officer Cole Mercer, badge 7142. And the numbers seemed to hang there longer than they should have, as if they carried weight he had not anticipated. Vanessa nodded once, a small movement, controlled, and in that gesture there was something older than the moment, something practiced, the discipline of someone who had spent years watching power misused and learning exactly how it revealed itself when no one thought they were being watched. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting a pale reflection across the windshield, and for a brief second, the interior of the car mirrored back the scene outside. Mercer's figure distorted slightly in the glass, the bag in his hand appearing larger, almost exaggerated, like a claim stretched beyond its truth. "You said routine," Vanessa repeated, her tone even, not challenging, simply placing the words back where they belonged, and Mercer shifted again, the movement small but no longer invisible, because now every detail carried consequence. Every motion was being seen, cataloged, remembered, behind them. Tessa Grant stepped closer to the vehicle, her eyes scanning the door frame, the handle, the narrow strip of metal where fingerprints would linger, where timing would leave traces no story could erase. And she noticed the faint smear near the edge of the rear door, not unusual on its own, but placed exactly where Mercer's hand would have been minutes earlier, before Vanessa had even arrived. "How long was the vehicle unattended?" Tessa asked, her voice calm, professional, and Mercer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was not. He replied quickly, too quickly, and the answer landed unevenly, like a piece that did not fit the rest of the puzzle. Vanessa's gaze shifted slightly, not toward Tessa, but toward the space between them, where the truth was beginning to take shape without being spoken aloud, and she let the silence stretch again, because silence, she knew, had a way of drawing out what words tried to hide. A distant car engine echoed from the upper level, then faded, leaving behind the steady rhythm of dripping water, each drop marking time in a place that suddenly felt suspended between two outcomes, one already written in Mercer's mind, the other assembling itself piece by piece in front of witnesses he had not accounted for. "Officer Mercer," Vanessa said again, her voice steady, measured. "Procedures exist for a reason," and she did not elaborate, did not need to, because the implication settled into the space around them, into the posture of the officers behind him, into the stillness of the onlookers who were no longer passive observers, but silent jurors. Mercer exhaled, a controlled breath, as if forcing himself back into the role he believed he still commanded, and he lifted the bag slightly higher, trying to reclaim the center of attention, but the gesture no longer carried the same authority. It felt staged now, rehearsed, and somewhere behind that realization, a flicker of doubt crossed his expression before he pushed it down. Tessa's gaze dropped once more to his body camera, still dark, still silent, and she spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if confirming something to herself that should be recording. And the words did not accuse, they simply existed, undeniable, and Mercer did not answer immediately, because for the first time, the narrative he had built was no longer the only one in the room. And as Vanessa stood there, composed, unshaken, the balance of power shifted again, not with force, not with volume, but with the quiet, irreversible weight of details beginning to align against him. "Procedure is not optional," Vanessa said, her voice calm, but carrying further now, not louder, just clearer, as if the space itself had begun to favor precision over force, and the words settled into the garage with a weight that did not need to be repeated. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible crack in the composure he had tried to maintain, and he shifted his stance again, squaring his shoulders, reclaiming posture, but the movement felt more deliberate now, less natural, like something being corrected instead of something that simply was. "You are in possession of illegal substances," he replied, each word measured, controlled, but no longer effortless, and the sentence echoed against the concrete in a way that made it sound rehearsed rather than real. Vanessa let the statement pass without interruption, her gaze drifting briefly to the bag, then back to Mercer, not dismissing it, not accepting it, simply acknowledging its presence as one piece in a larger pattern that was still unfolding. Behind Mercer, the second officer shifted his weight, glancing toward Tessa and then away, as if unsure which direction authority was moving, and that uncertainty began to spread, subtle but undeniable, like a current beneath the surface. Tessa stepped closer to the rear door of the vehicle, careful not to touch anything, her eyes tracing the edge of the frame, the handle, the narrow seam where the door met the body, and she leaned slightly, examining the interior without crossing the threshold, her attention precise, methodical, as if every inch of space held a timeline waiting to be read. "Chain of custody starts now," she said quietly, not to Mercer, not to Vanessa, but to the moment itself, and the statement landed with a different kind of authority, one rooted in process rather than position. Mercer's jaw tightened again, and for a fraction of a second, he looked at her, really looked, as if reassessing something he had not expected to matter. Then he turned back to Vanessa, attempting to anchor the scene where he had first placed it. "You can explain it at the station," he said, but the words felt thinner now, stretched across a situation that was no longer entirely his. Vanessa's hands remained still against the car, her posture unchanged, but there was a shift in her expression, not visible to everyone, only to those who were paying attention, a slight softening around the eyes, not of fear, but of recognition, as if the truth she had already understood was beginning to surface for others as well. A drop of water fell from the edge of the open door, hitting the concrete with a sharp, isolated sound, and in that brief pause, The garage seemed to recalibrate, attention redistributing, no longer fixed solely on the accusation, but on the inconsistencies surrounding it. "Officer Mercer," Vanessa said again, her tone steady, each word placed with care. "Before anything moves forward, you will confirm your recording is active." And the request was simple, procedural, undeniable, and it hung in the air with a quiet authority that did not need reinforcement. Mercer did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking once more toward his chest, toward the camera that remained dark, then back to Vanessa, and in that hesitation, however brief, something essential shifted, something irreversible, because hesitation had no place in certainty. Tessa's gaze followed that movement, and she spoke again, still calm, still controlled. "Department policy requires continuous recording during searches, and she did not add anything else, did not accuse, did not escalate, because the fact itself was enough." Mercer inhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier now, and he adjusted his stance once more, but this time the movement felt smaller, contained, as if the space around him had narrowed. Vanessa remained still, composed, present, her calm no longer just her own, but something that had begun to shape the room. And as the seconds passed, the narrative Mercer had constructed continued to loosen, thread by thread, until even the simplest detail, the absence of a blinking light, carried more weight than the evidence he held in his hand. Mercer's silence stretched just long enough to be noticed, not by everyone, but by the ones who understood what silence meant when a question had only one correct answer, and his hand moved instinctively toward his chest, fingers brushing the edge of the body camera before stopping halfway, as if the gesture itself had suddenly become evidence. "It is active," he said, but the words came with a slight delay, a fraction of a second that did not belong in a moment like this, and the small red indicator remained dark, unblinking, unchanged. Tessa did not react immediately. She did not need to. Her eyes stayed on the device, then lifted slowly to meet his, and in that quiet exchange something unspoken passed between them, something procedural, something final, because facts did not require volume to be understood. Behind him, the second officer shifted again, this time taking a half step back, creating space where there had been alignment, and that distance, small as it was, spoke louder than any challenge could have. Vanessa lowered her hands from the car, not abruptly, not in defiance, simply because the moment had changed, and her posture adjusted with it, shoulders still squared, chin still level, but no longer positioned as someone being directed, rather as someone observing the direction itself. The bag in Mercer's hand seemed lighter now, not physically, but in meaning, its presence no longer dominating the scene, but competing with the absence of something far more critical. "Officer Mercer," Vanessa said, her tone steady, measured, each word placed with care. "If your recording is active, then there will be no issue confirming the sequence of events." And she did not elaborate further, because she did not need to. The implication was complete, self-contained, undeniable. Mercer exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier now, and he adjusted his grip on the bag, lifting it slightly again as if to anchor the narrative back in place. But the motion felt rehearsed, almost defensive, and the confidence that had once accompanied it no longer held. A drop of water slid from the edge of the car door and struck the ground, the sound sharp in the quiet, marking another second passing. Another moment in which the balance continued to shift. Tessa stepped closer now, not toward Vanessa, but toward Mercer, her movement deliberate, her presence calm but unmistakably firm, and she glanced once more at the camera, then at him. "You will need to verify that immediately," she said, her voice even, procedural, and the phrasing left no room for interpretation, no room for delay. Mercer's jaw tightened, and for the first time, the control he had projected began to thin, not collapsing, not breaking, but losing its edge, its certainty, and he looked around briefly, not searching for support, but registering the absence of it, the way the space had subtly reoriented itself away from him. Vanessa watched without moving, her expression unchanged, her calm now fully integrated into the moment, no longer separate from it, but shaping it, guiding it without force. "Details always tell the truth," she said again. Softer this time, almost reflective, and The words settled into the air with a weight that did not need emphasis, because the details were already there, already aligning, already beginning to speak for themselves. Mercer's hand hovered near the camera once more, and this time he pressed the button, a small, deliberate motion, and a faint click followed, then a brief flicker of light. But it came too late, arriving after the moment that mattered, after the gap that could not be filled. And that delay, that single missing piece of time, hung in the air heavier than anything he had found in the car. Tessa's gaze did not shift, her voice quiet but certain. "There is a gap," she said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating, and in that statement, the structure of Mercer's narrative loosened further, the edges no longer holding, the center no longer secure. Vanessa remained still, composed, her presence steady, and as the seconds passed, the focus of the garage moved away from the accusation entirely, settling instead on the space between what had been claimed and what could be proven, and in that space, the truth was no longer hidden, it was forming, piece by piece, in plain sight. The faint click of the camera activating did not restore the moment. It exposed it, and the small red light that finally blinked to life felt less like confirmation and more like a marker of everything that had already been missed. Mercer lowered his hand slowly, as if the motion itself could smooth over the gap. But the delay lingered in the air, unspoken yet fully understood, and for the first time, the bag in his grip seemed secondary, almost incidental, its importance fading against the weight of a timeline that no longer aligned. Tessa took another step forward, her posture unchanged, calm, deliberate, but her presence now carried a quiet authority that did not compete with Mercer's. It replaced it, and she glanced briefly toward the other officers, then back to him. "We will need the full sequence," she said, her tone even, procedural, and the phrasing left no space for interpretation, no room to reshape what had already occurred. Mercer nodded once, a small, controlled movement, but the certainty behind it had thinned, and his eyes flickered toward the vehicle, then toward the floor, as if searching for something that could anchor the narrative again, something that would hold. Under scrutiny, but the details were no longer cooperating. Vanessa remained still, her composure steady, her presence no longer defined by the accusation, but by the clarity she carried through it, and she watched as the moment continued to shift, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability that could not be reversed. The sound of distant footsteps echoed from the upper level, then faded, replaced again by the slow rhythm of water dripping onto concrete, each drop marking time in a space that had moved from confrontation into examination. Tessa's gaze returned to the vehicle, and she leaned slightly, careful, precise, observing the interior without touching it, her eyes tracing the path Mercer would have taken, the angle of his reach, the placement of the bag, and the more she mapped it in her mind, the less it aligned with the story he had presented. "You approached from the rear passenger side," she said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating, and Mercer's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, the reaction subtle but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. "That is correct," he replied, but again, the timing of his answer lagged just enough to matter, and the pattern was beginning to form, small inconsistencies stacking into something larger. Vanessa shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if settling into a space that now belonged to process rather than control, and she spoke again, her voice calm, measured. "Sequence determines credibility," and the words carried through the garage with a quiet finality, not directed at Mercer alone, but at the moment itself. Behind them, the second officer lowered his gaze, his stance no longer aligned with Mercer's, and the separation became more visible, more defined, as if the structure of authority had begun to reorganize itself in real time. Mercer adjusted his grip on the bag again, lifting it slightly as if to reassert its significance, but the gesture felt diminished, its impact reduced by the growing presence of facts that could not be adjusted, could not be reframed. Tessa straightened, her attention returning fully to him, and for a brief second, the two of them stood in a quiet standoff, not of force, but of process, one grounded in assertion, the other in verification, and the difference between them had never been clearer. The red light on the camera blinked steadily now. Consistent, reliable, but its steadiness only emphasized the absence that came before it, the missing minutes that no recording could recover. And in that absence, the foundation of Mercer's narrative continued to weaken. Vanessa's gaze moved once more to the bag, then back to Mercer, and she said nothing further, because she did not need to. The moment had already begun to speak for itself, the details aligning, the sequence forming, and as the seconds passed, the balance of power shifted again, not with confrontation, not with raised voices, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of truth assembling itself in plain sight. You said the vehicle was not unattended. Tessa's voice cut gently through the silence. Not sharp, not forceful, but precise enough to draw every eye back to the same point. And Mercer's gaze flickered again, just for a second, before he steadied it. That is correct, he replied. But the repetition did not strengthen his position. It revealed its strain, like a line being pulled too tight. The red light on his camera blinked steadily now, rhythmic, dependable, but it only emphasized the absence before it, the unrecorded minutes that no explanation could reconstruct. And in that gap, the narrative he had built began to feel incomplete, uneven at the edges. Vanessa remained still, her composure unbroken, her presence no longer reactive but quietly directive, shaping the pace of the moment without raising her voice. And she watched Mercer the way she had watched witnesses for years, not for what they said, but for what shifted when they said it. A faint breeze moved through the garage entrance, carrying the scent of rain and cold air, brushing against the fabric of her coat, and somewhere in that small movement, the tension seemed to settle into something more focused, more exact, sequence. Vanessa said softly, almost to herself, but the word carried, anchoring the moment again, and Tessa nodded slightly, picking up the thread without hesitation. Walk me through it, she said, her tone even, procedural. And this time the request was not optional, it was structure. Mercer inhaled, slower now, his shoulders rising just enough to show the effort. And he glanced briefly at the vehicle, then back at Tessa. I approached the car, observed something suspicious, and conducted a search, he said, each phrase carefully placed. But the simplicity of it no longer matched the complexity forming around him. Tessa did not interrupt. She let the statement sit, then tilted her head slightly. From which side? She asked, and again, the answer came a fraction too late. Rear passenger, he said, and the delay, small but consistent, continued to build, piece by piece. Vanessa's eyes shifted to the door, then to the ground beneath it, where a faint line of moisture traced the path of the earlier rain, interrupted briefly near the handle, as if something had disturbed it before she arrived, and she said nothing, because she did not need to. The detail existed on its own, waiting to be noticed. Behind Mercer, the second officer's stance changed again, his weight shifting fully to 1 foot, creating more distance, and that quiet separation spoke louder than any challenge could have. Tessa stepped closer to the door frame, her gaze narrowing slightly as she followed the line of the moisture, the subtle break in its pattern, and she exhaled softly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, as if a piece had just clicked into place. You reached inside before the subject arrived, she said, not accusing, not raising her voice, simply stating what the sequence suggested, and Mercer's jaw tightened, the reaction immediate, controlled but visible, and for the first time, he did not answer right away. The garage seemed to hold that pause, stretching it, giving it weight, and the sound of dripping water echoed again, marking another second where silence said more than words. Vanessa's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet certainty in it now, not of victory, not of relief, but of alignment, as if the truth she had recognized from the beginning was finally taking shape for others. Mercer adjusted his grip on the bag once more, but the motion lacked purpose now, no longer anchoring the moment, only drawing attention to itself, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried less conviction than before. I followed protocol, he said, but the statement landed without support, without reinforcement, and in the space that followed, it began to dissolve. Tessa straightened slowly, her posture firm, her presence now unmistakably authoritative, and she glanced once more at the blinking camera, then back at Mercer. Protocol requires documentation, she said, her tone calm, final, and the words settled into the air like a closing argument, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. And as the seconds passed, the balance shifted again, not with confrontation, not with force, but with the quiet, irreversible clarity of a sequence that no longer matched the story being told. The air shifted again, quieter now but sharper, as if every sound had been stripped down to its edges, and Mercer stood there with the bag still in his hand, but no longer at the center of the moment, no longer controlling it, because the weight had moved, settled somewhere else, somewhere he could not reach. Tessa did not step back this time. She stayed where she was, her gaze steady, anchored in the details that had already begun to separate his version from reality, and she spoke again. Slower now, each word deliberate. You stated the vehicle was secure, and that you initiated the search upon arrival. And she paused just enough for the words to settle, just enough to let the sequence exist on its own before continuing. But the camera shows no initial approach, no first contact, no uninterrupted record, and her eyes flicked briefly to the blinking light on his chest, then back to him. Only what began after. And the implication did not need to be spoken, it was already there, already understood. Mercer's grip tightened again, the plastic of the evidence bag crinkling faintly, the sound small but sharp in the silence. And he shifted his stance once more, but the movement felt contained now, as if the space around him had narrowed, leaving less room for control, less room for certainty. Vanessa watched without moving, her presence steady, her calm no longer just her own but something that had spread through the moment, shaping it, guiding it without force. And she spoke again, her voice soft but precise. Time is the one thing you cannot recreate. And the words landed differently now, not as observation, but as conclusion. A distant elevator chimed somewhere above, the sound faint, almost out of place, and then faded, leaving behind the steady rhythm of dripping water, each drop marking the passing seconds that Mercer could no longer account for. Tessa turned slightly, her attention shifting toward the other officer who had been standing behind Mercer, and she gave a small nod, not a command, not a directive, but enough to signal that the moment had moved beyond a single narrative, beyond a single voice, and the officer stepped forward cautiously, his posture uncertain, his eyes moving between Mercer and the vehicle as if seeing both for the first time. "Did you observe the initial contact?" Tessa asked him, her tone even, and the question hung in the air with a quiet weight, because it did not challenge Mercer directly. It widened the frame, brought in another perspective, another piece of the sequence. The officer hesitated, just for a second, then shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am," he said, and the admission, simple and unembellished, settled into the space like a final piece falling into place. Mercer exhaled, slower now, the breath heavier, and he looked at the officer briefly, then away, as if recalculating, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. Vanessa's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet finality in it now, not of triumph, not of relief, but of alignment, as if the truth had fully emerged, no longer hidden in fragments, but standing complete in front of them. Tessa turned back to Mercer, her posture firm, her voice calm. "We will need to secure the scene and review all footage from the garage," she said, and the phrasing was no longer a request. It was procedure moving forward, inevitable, structured, and Mercer did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reshape. The red light on his camera continued to blink, steady, consistent, but its rhythm only underscored what had already been lost, what could not be recovered. And as the seconds passed, the focus of the garage shifted fully away from the accusation, settling instead on the sequence, the gap, the details that had quietly dismantled everything he had tried to construct, leaving him standing not at the center of authority, but at the center of a story that no longer held. The moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and unavoidable, like something finally finding its place after being forced out of alignment, and Mercer stood there with the evidence still in his hand. But the meaning of it had shifted completely, no longer a point of control, no longer the center of the scene, just an object now, waiting to be examined along with everything else. Tessa turned slightly, her attention expanding beyond him, beyond the single action, and into the structure. Surrounding it, the cameras mounted along the ceiling, the entry points, the lines of sight that recorded what people forgot, and she raised her chin just enough to signal upward. All feeds from this level will be preserved, she said, her tone calm, procedural, and the words carried with them a certainty that did not depend on agreement. Mercer's eyes followed her gesture for a brief second, tracking the cameras he had not considered, the angles he had not accounted for, and that glance, small as it was, revealed more than any denial could have. Vanessa watched that movement, the subtle shift in his focus, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, only recognition, as if she had seen this pattern before, not in this place, not in this form, but in the way certainty unraveled when it met documentation. A faint vibration passed through the concrete as another vehicle moved above them, the sound distant, steady, and the rhythm of dripping water continued beneath it, marking time that no one could reclaim. Sequence extends beyond a single perspective, Vanessa said quietly, her voice steady, almost reflective, and the statement settled into the moment as both observation and boundary, drawing a line between what was claimed and what could be verified. Mercer shifted again, his stance tightening, and he lifted his chin slightly, attempting to regain a sense of authority. "You are still under investigation," he said, but the words lacked the force they had carried before. They sounded narrower now, confined by the details that had begun to surround them. Tessa did not respond to the statement directly. She did not need to. Her focus remained on the process, on the next step, and she reached for her radio, her fingers pressing the button with a controlled, deliberate motion, requesting internal review and immediate retrieval of garage surveillance, she said, her voice even, and the response crackled back almost instantly, confirming what had already been set in motion. Behind Mercer, the second officer took another step back, creating clear distance now, no longer aligned, no longer sharing the same center, and the separation was no longer subtle. It was visible, defined, a quiet acknowledgement of where the moment had moved. Mercer exhaled slowly, the breath heavier than before, and he looked at Vanessa again, really looked this time, as if trying to find something in her expression that would restore his position, but there was nothing there to take, nothing reactive, nothing he could use, only calm, steady presence. Vanessa met his gaze without resistance, without challenge, and in that stillness there was a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken, because the truth was no longer contained within her. It had moved into the space around them, into the cameras above, into the record that was already forming. Tessa lowered her radio, her posture unchanged, and she glanced once more at the blinking light on Mercer's camera, then at the bag in his hand, and finally at the vehicle itself, as if seeing all three as parts of the same incomplete story. "Everything from this point forward is documented," she said, her tone calm, final, and the statement did not escalate the moment. It grounded it, anchored it in a process that could not be undone. Mercer did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to assert that would not be measured, nothing left to claim that would not be tested, and as the seconds passed, the garage no longer felt like a place of accusation, but of record, of alignment, of quiet, inevitable accountability, and in that shift, the balance had already moved beyond him, settling into a truth that no longer depended on his version to exist. The radio response faded, leaving behind a quieter kind of certainty, the kind that did not rush, did not demand attention, but settled in place and waited to be acknowledged. And Tessa stood there for a moment longer, her gaze lifting once more toward the ceiling cameras, tracing their positions, calculating the angles, the blind spots that were not as blind as they seemed, and she spoke again, softer now, but no less precise. "Camera 3 covers the rear approach," and her eyes dropped back to Mercer, "and camera 5 captures the side entry," and she did not need to say more, because the implication was already complete, the sequence already mapped. Mercer followed her line of sight again, slower this time, his eyes lingering on the fixtures above as if seeing them differently, not as part of the environment, but as witnesses, silent and permanent, and for the first time, the space around him felt smaller, more defined, as if the walls themselves had moved closer. Vanessa remained still, her presence unchanged, but there was a shift in her focus, not outward now, not on Mercer, but inward, reflective, as if she were stepping back into a role she knew well, not as the subject of the moment, but as its observer, its interpreter, and she spoke quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach both of them. Records do not rely on memory. And the words settled into the air with a calm finality. Mercer lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, attempting to recenter himself. "You are making assumptions," he said, but the statement felt less like a defense, and more like a delay, something to fill the space while the structure around him continued to tighten. Tessa did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch again, then reached for her radio once more, her movements controlled, deliberate. "Confirm retrieval of feeds from cameras 3 and 5. Timestamp starting 10 minutes prior," she said, her tone steady, and the response came back quickly. A brief acknowledgement that carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. Behind Mercer, the second officer shifted again, this time fully stepping to the side, no longer positioned behind him but beside the scene itself, an observer rather than a participant, and that change, subtle but unmistakable, marked a line that had already been crossed. The faint hum of the lights continued overhead, steady, indifferent, and the drip of water echoed again, each drop marking time that was no longer his to shape, no longer his to define. Mercer adjusted his stance once more, but the movement lacked the confidence it once held. His shoulders no longer squared with certainty but held in place by effort, and he glanced once more at Vanessa, searching for something, a reaction, a shift, anything that might restore the balance. But she remained unchanged, composed, present, her calm now fully integrated into the moment. "Officer Mercer," Tessa said again, her voice even, measured, "until review is complete, you will maintain position." And the phrasing was careful, procedural. But the meaning was clear. The moment had moved beyond him, beyond his control, into a process that did not bend. Mercer nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but the absence of resistance spoke louder than agreement, and he remained where he stood, the bag still in his hand, but no longer as evidence, no longer as authority, simply as an object awaiting verification. Vanessa's gaze shifted briefly to the cameras above, then back to the space in front of her, and she said nothing more, because there was nothing left to add. The sequence was no longer theoretical. It was in motion, being retrieved, being reviewed, and as the seconds passed, the garage no longer felt like a place of accusation, but of record, of alignment, of quiet, inevitable clarity, and in that stillness, the truth was no longer something to be argued. It was something about to be seen. The confirmation came through the radio in a tone that was almost too calm for what it carried, a quiet voice stating that the feeds were being pulled, that the timestamps were aligning, that the system was already processing what the room had begun to understand, and Tessa lowered the device slowly, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. But something in the air shifted again, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the moment had crossed from uncertainty into verification. Mercer did not speak, not immediately, and that silence, once a tool he controlled, now sat heavy on him, pressing inward, narrowing the space around his thoughts, and his eyes moved again to the ceiling, to the cameras he had dismissed, now fixed in place, unblinking, holding the minutes he could not account for. Vanessa remained composed, her hands resting naturally at her sides, her shoulders relaxed but firm, and there was no trace of tension in her posture, only presence, the kind that did not react but endured, and she watched as the structure around the moment continued to form, piece by piece, without her needing to guide it. A faint hum rose from somewhere beyond the garage, perhaps from the building's systems or from a distant generator, and it blended with the steady rhythm of water dripping onto concrete, creating a low, constant sound that seemed to underline everything, like a quiet reminder that time had not stopped, that it had simply moved forward without him. "Feeds are coming in," the radio voice added, and though it was directed to Tessa, it reached everyone, settling into the space with a finality that did not need emphasis. Mercer exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, and he shifted his stance again, but there was no repositioning now that could restore what had already begun to unravel. no adjustment that could fill the gap left by those missing minutes. And he glanced briefly at the bag in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time as something separate from his control, something that would soon be measured against a record he did not shape. Tessa turned slightly, her attention moving from the physical space to the process unfolding beyond it, and she spoke again, her voice calm, procedural. "We will wait for confirmation before proceeding." And the phrasing carried no urgency, only certainty, the kind that did not need to rush because it knew where it was going. Behind Mercer, the second officer stood fully apart now, no longer aligned in stance or presence. His gaze lowered, his position clearly shifted from participant to observer, and the separation was no longer subtle. It was defined, acknowledged without being spoken. Vanessa's eyes moved once more to the cameras above, then back to Mercer, and for a brief second, there was something almost reflective in her expression, not directed at him, but at the moment itself, as if she were observing the way truth revealed itself when left undisturbed, when allowed to move through its own sequence. "Evidence speaks in order," she said quietly, her voice steady, and the words settled into the air like a final piece of instruction, not for Mercer, not for Tessa, but for the process itself. Mercer swallowed, a small, involuntary motion, and his gaze dropped for a fraction of a second before lifting again. But the confidence that had once held his posture was no longer there, replaced by something tighter, more contained, as if he were holding himself in place rather than standing there naturally. The radio crackled once more, a brief pause, then a voice returning with a simple update. "Initial footage confirms pre-arrival contact with the vehicle," and the words, though measured, landed with a quiet weight that shifted everything fully into place. No one spoke immediately after, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reshape. The sequence had been established, the gap filled not by explanation, but by record, and as the silence settled again, it was no longer uncertain, no longer suspended. It was complete, holding within it the quiet, irreversible truth that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The words did not echo, they settled, final and complete, and the confirmation from the radio seemed to absorb the last remaining fragments of uncertainty in the room, leaving behind a stillness that no one rushed to break, because there was nothing left to contest, nothing left to reshape. Mercer stood where he was, the bag still in his hand, but it no longer defined the moment, no longer carried the authority he had placed in it, and his grip loosened slightly, the plastic crinkling again in a softer, almost incidental sound, as if even the object itself had lost its purpose. Tessa did not move immediately. She allowed the silence to hold, to settle into something stable, something undeniable, and then she took a single step forward, her posture straight, her presence calm but unmistakably firm, and she spoke with the same measured tone that had guided the moment from the beginning. "Officer Mercer, you will place the evidence on the hood of the vehicle," and the instruction was not forceful. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of process, of sequence, of everything that had already been established. Mercer hesitated, not visibly to everyone, but enough, just enough for the delay to register, and then he complied, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, setting the bag down where it no longer belonged to him, where it became part of the record rather than part of his control. The sound of it touching the metal surface was quiet, almost insignificant, but in that moment it marked a shift, a transfer, a line that could not be crossed back. Vanessa watched the movement without expression, her calm unchanged, her presence steady, and there was no sense of triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, only a quiet recognition of what had already taken place, of how the moment had unfolded exactly as truth tends to unfold when left undisturbed. Tessa reached into her pocket and retrieved a pair of gloves, slipping them on with careful precision, each movement deliberate, procedural, and she approached the hood of the car, her attention focused not on Mercer now, but on the evidence itself, on the way it would be documented, handled, preserved. Behind them, the second officer remained still, fully separated from Mercer now, his role reduced to observation, his presence quiet, and the distance between them had become permanent in a way that did not need to be spoken. The hum of the lights continued overhead, steady and indifferent, and the drip of water echoed again, marking time that had already moved beyond the moment of accusation and into something more structured, more exact. Chain of custody begins here, Tessa said softly, almost as if she were noting it for the record itself, and the words carried a quiet finality, a transition from narrative to documentation, from claim to proof. Mercer stood with his hands now free, but the absence of the bag did not restore anything. It only revealed what had already been lost, and his posture shifted slightly, not with authority, but with containment, as if he were holding himself within the boundaries that had closed around him. Vanessa's gaze lifted briefly to the cameras above, then returned to the scene in front of her, and she spoke one last time, her voice calm, steady. Process does not bend for position, and the words settled into the space like a closing statement, not directed at Mercer alone, but at the moment itself, at the structure that had revealed everything without force, without escalation. Tessa secured the evidence carefully, her movements precise, her attention unwavering, and as she stepped back, the scene no longer held tension, no longer held uncertainty, it held only the quiet, irreversible alignment of facts, and in that stillness, Mercer no longer stood as the one who defined the situation, but as the one now defined by it. The balance fully shifted, the narrative complete, and the truth no longer something that needed to be spoken, because it had already been seen. The garage no longer felt like a place where something had happened, it felt like a place where something had been revealed, and the difference settled quietly into every corner, into the hum of the lights, into the steady drip of water, into the stillness that followed once everything unnecessary had fallen away. Mercer stood without the evidence now, his hands empty, his posture no longer anchored in authority but held in place by the absence of it, and he did not look at the cameras again, did not look at Tessa, because there was nothing left in those directions for him to reclaim. Tessa removed her gloves slowly, folding them with care before placing them aside, her movements controlled, deliberate, and she glanced once more at the secured evidence, then at the vehicle, and finally at Vanessa, her gaze steady, acknowledging without words that the process had done what it was designed to do, that it had moved forward without interruption, without compromise. Vanessa remained composed, her presence unchanged, and she took a small step back from the car, not retreating, not distancing, simply repositioning herself as the moment transitioned fully out of confrontation and into record, and for a brief second, her eyes lifted toward the ceiling, toward the cameras that had captured what no voice could alter, what no narrative could reshape, and then she lowered her gaze again, returning to the quiet reality in front of her. The second officer shifted slightly, his stance relaxed now, no longer braced, no longer aligned with anything that needed defending, and the space between him and Mercer remained, clear and defined, a boundary that had formed without instruction and would not be undone. A faint sound echoed from the entrance of the garage, distant footsteps, a door closing somewhere above, the world continuing beyond the moment, indifferent to what had just unfolded, and yet within this space, everything had changed. Scene is secured, Tessa said quietly into her radio, her voice calm, final, and the response came back just as measured, confirming what was already evident, that the moment had concluded, that the next steps would follow, structured, documented, inevitable. Mercer exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without resistance, without the tight control he had held before, and he shifted his weight once more. But there was no adjustment left to make, no position left to regain, only the quiet reality of where he now stood. Vanessa looked at him then, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a clarity that carried no need for either, and she spoke one final time, her voice steady, almost reflective. Authority is not what you can take in a moment. It is what remains when the moment is examined. And the words settled into the air with a quiet permanence, not as a challenge, not as a victory, but as a truth that did not require agreement. No one responded, because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to contest. And as the seconds passed, the garage returned to its natural stillness, the hum of the lights, the echo of water, the faint sounds from above, all continuing as they had before, unchanged and yet entirely different. Vanessa turned slightly, her steps measured, unhurried, and began to walk toward the exit, her figure moving through the space with the same quiet composure she had held from the beginning, leaving behind not a scene of conflict, but a record of what had been revealed, and behind her, the truth remained, not spoken, not argued, simply present, steady, and complete.